The air in the Presbyterian Hospital laboratory in New York smelled of formaldehyde and fear. It was October 1940, and Dr. Charles Richard Drew stood over a centrifuge machine that looked more like a modified cream separator than a piece of medical equipment, watching blood plasma spin away from red cells in a process that every textbook said was impossible to scale, impossible to standardize, impossible to ship across an ocean where men were dying by the thousands. His hands, steady despite 3 sleepless nights, adjusted the speed one more time. The machine hummed, vibrating through the floor tiles, and Drew knew that what he was about to do would either save civilization or end his career. He was a black man in a white medical establishment about to tell the British government, the American Red Cross, and every surgeon who'd ever dismissed him that they'd been doing blood transfusions wrong for more than 40 years. Drew had been told his entire life what was impossible. Born in 1904 in Washington, D.C., the son of a carpet layer, he'd been rejected from multiple medical schools before Columbia finally admitted him in 1928. His professors whispered that black hands weren't precise enough for surgery. Hospital boards suggested he stick to general practice in Negro communities. But Drew's mind moved differently than other doctors. While they saw blood as a single substance, he saw a complex fluid with separable components, each with different properties, different lifespans, different possibilities. When he began his doctoral research in 1938, examining blood chemistry and preservation methods, he discovered something that would change everything. Plasma, the liquid portion of blood, could survive refrigeration for weeks, even months, without degrading. Whole blood lasted 7 days at most. Every military surgeon, every emergency room, every battlefield hospital was working within a 7-day window that cost thousands of lives. Drew saw the window open wider. His dissertation, Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation, ran 200 pages of meticulous research that proved blood could be preserved indefinitely if its components were separated and frozen individually, then reconstituted when needed. The medical establishment greeted it with polite skepticism and quiet racism. One reviewer noted that while the research was technically sound, it seemed impractical for real-world application. Code words Drew had learned to translate, as we don't trust a black man to revolutionize our field. But across the Atlantic, people were dying in numbers that made skepticism a luxury Britain could no longer afford. The Luftwaffe was bombing London nightly. Hospitals overflowed with casualties whose blood loss exceeded every available transfusion supply. Traditional whole blood shipments from America arrived spoiled, unusable, criminally wasteful. In desperation, the British Blood Transfusion Service reached out to American researchers with a simple question that masked existential terror. "Can anyone save us?" Drew said yes, before anyone asked him directly. In August 1940, he received a call from Dr. John Scudder at Columbia Presbyterian, who'd read his dissertation and recognized genius when he saw it regardless of the color of its author. "Drew, the British need 5,000 pints of plasma in 3 months or London falls. Can you do it?" Drew looked at the modified cream separator he'd been tinkering with, the network of refrigeration units he'd been testing, the preservation techniques every medical board had dismissed as theoretical. He thought of the faces in his segregated medical school classes, the hospitals that wouldn't let him operate, the blood banks that didn't exist because no one believed they could. "I can do 5,000 pints a month," he said quietly. "But we're going to break every rule they ever wrote." The Blood for Britain campaign began on September 5, 1940, with Drew as its medical director, a title that made him the first black man to direct a white medical program of national importance. He set up operations in a converted storage room at Presbyterian Hospital, working 18-hour shifts to coordinate blood collection from multiple New York hospitals while simultaneously inventing the entire infrastructure of large-scale blood banking. He centralized collection centers where donors could give blood in sterile, controlled environments instead of the chaotic bedside donations that contaminated half of all transfusions. He mandated that every pint of plasma be tested for bacterial contamination before shipping, a quality control measure other doctors called paranoid until they saw the survival rates. He trained personnel in sterile handling techniques, firing anyone who cut corners, regardless of their credentials or connections. "We're not collecting blood," he told his staff one night, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We're collecting lives. Treat it sacred or get out." But the real revolution was the preservation process itself. Drew had discovered that plasma could be separated through centrifugation, treated with merthiolate as an antibacterial agent, diluted with saline, and stored in sealed containers that could survive the Atlantic crossing in refrigerated ship holds. The British cream separators he ordered arrived broken, so he rebuilt them from scratch, engineering modifications that increased plasma yield by 40%. Traditional methods produced maybe 50 clear plasma units per day. Drew's operation was producing 300 within 2 weeks. The medical establishment watched in stunned silence as this black doctor from Washington transformed blood preservation from an art into a science, from a battlefield gamble into an industrial process with quality metrics, standardized protocols, and survival rates that defied every previous benchmark. The plasma shipments began arriving in Britain in late September. Surgeons who'd been rationing transfusions, choosing which soldiers lived and died based on dwindling whole blood supplies, suddenly had access to plasma that worked universally, required no blood typing, and remained viable for weeks. The letters that came back to Drew were written in the shaking handwriting of doctors who'd stopped believing in miracles. "Your plasma saved 60 men in a single bombing raid," one Royal Army surgeon wrote. "We're performing surgeries we'd given up as impossible. You've given us hope in liquid form." By January 1941, when the Blood for Britain campaign concluded, Drew's operation had collected 14,556 blood donations and shipped over 5,000 liters of plasma across the ocean. British military medical officers estimated the plasma saved between 15 and 20,000 lives, maybe more. Churchill would later call it the logistical miracle that kept Britain fighting. Drew called it proof that excellence had no color. The American Red Cross was paying attention. In February 1941, as America edged toward war, the organization asked Drew to establish a mass blood collection program for the U.S. military, this time with unlimited resources and national scope. He became assistant director of the Red Cross pilot program in New York, designing the nation's first large-scale blood bank system from the ground up. Among his innovations were mobile blood collection units, refrigerated trucks that could travel to communities instead of waiting for donors to come to hospitals. The press nicknamed them bloodmobiles, and they became icons of American home front mobilization, rolling symbols of Drew's vision that blood donation should be accessible, dignified, and universal. His protocols became the standard for the American Red Cross, then for military medicine worldwide. His preservation techniques were taught at every medical school. His system saved more lives than any weapon America deployed. But America's Red Cross had a policy Drew hadn't known about when he took the position. In late 1941, under pressure from military leadership and Southern congressmen, the organization ordered that blood donations be segregated by race. Blood from black donors would be stored separately, labeled by race, and used only for black soldiers. White soldiers would receive only white blood, regardless of battlefield need or medical necessity. The policy had no scientific basis, no medical justification, no purpose except to preserve social hierarchy even at the cost of American lives. Drew, the man who'd proven blood was universal, who'd built a system on the principle that plasma didn't care about skin color, was ordered to enforce segregation of the very substance he'd made color blind. On April 3, 1941, he walked into the Red Cross headquarters in Washington and placed his resignation letter on the director's desk. "I cannot be complicit in a policy that contradicts medical science and human decency. He wrote, "If American blood must be separated by race, it will be done without my name attached." His resignation made national headlines. The white newspapers buried it on inside pages while black publications ran it front and center. Drew became a symbol of resistance to scientific racism, though he never sought the role. He simply returned to surgery, becoming the first black examiner for the American Board of Surgery in 1942, then chief of surgery at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, where he trained a generation of black surgeons who would integrate American medicine through pure, undeniable competence. He operated until his hands cramped, taught until his voice gave out, published papers that white medical journals initially rejected until other researchers confirmed his findings, and the editors had to admit they dismissed genius out of habit. His students remembered him for a phrase he repeated like a mantra: "Excellence of performance will transcend artificial barriers created by race or position." He believed it even when America tried to prove him wrong. On April 1, 1950, Drew was driving to a medical conference at Tuskegee University when his car left the road near Burlington, North Carolina. He was taken to Alamance General Hospital, where surgeons, including one of his former students, fought for 3 hours to save him from massive traumatic injuries. He died at 1:35 a.m., 45 years old, leaving behind a wife, 4 children, and a medical revolution that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Rumors immediately spread that he'd been denied treatment at a white hospital, that he'd bled to death while segregation killed the father of the blood bank. The rumors weren't true. He'd received every possible medical intervention, but they persisted because they felt true to the America that had forced him to resign, that had segregated the very blood he taught the world to share. The irony was unbearable, and the black community carried it like a wound that wouldn't heal. But the real legacy wasn't in the rumors. It was in the blood banks operating in every American city, using Drew's protocols. In the plasma shipments that saved lives in Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. In the bloodmobiles still rolling through neighborhoods, descendants of his mobile units. In the American Red Cross finally abandoning blood segregation in 1950, the year he died, as if his death shamed them into decency. In the surgeons trained in his techniques, who desegregated operating rooms simply by being too good to exclude. In every emergency room where O-negative blood sits ready, preserved using methods Drew pioneered, waiting to save someone who will never know his name. Modern medicine's blood supply infrastructure, the system that makes transfusions routine instead of miraculous, the network that turns strangers into lifesavers through simple donation, all of it traces back to a black man standing in a converted storage room in 1940, watching plasma separate in a centrifuge and deciding that excellence would be his revolution. In 1981, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp with Drew's face, calling him a pioneering blood researcher. In 2000, Columbia University renamed its surgical society after him. In 2010, the Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science was established in Los Angeles, training minority healthcare workers in communities the establishment still underserves. But perhaps the truest monument sits in blood banks worldwide, silent refrigerators holding liquid life in bags that don't list the race of their donors because a doctor from Washington once refused to accept that healing could be segregated. Every trauma patient receiving plasma, every surgery supported by banked blood, every battlefield medic with refrigerated supply, they're all inheriting Drew's refusal to accept limitations that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with power. The tragedy is how many lives might have been saved if Drew had lived beyond 45, if that car hadn't swerved, if America had given him the resources and respect he deserved from the beginning instead of making him fight for basic recognition. His students spoke of research he'd planned into blood diseases, preservation techniques he'd sketched but never tested, surgical innovations he'd mentioned in passing that died with him. One protege found notebooks in Drew's office after his death filled with diagrams for improved plasma separation, theories about blood component therapy that wouldn't be mainstream until the 1970s, ideas decades ahead of their time written in careful handwriting late at night when exhaustion finally released his imagination. He saw medicine's future, the protege said at Drew's memorial service, voice breaking. He just didn't live long enough to build all of it. Yet what he did build endures with a permanence that transcends mortality. The Blood for Britain campaign, conceived in desperation and executed with precision that redefined possible, proved that American innovation could save the world when stripped of prejudice. The Red Cross blood banking system, designed by a man they later tried to erase, became the model every nation copied. The protocols written in that Presbyterian hospital storage room became textbook standard, taught to medical students who don't know they're learning from a black doctor's revolution. Drew didn't just change medicine. He proved that excellence written in one man's work becomes universal law once the world stops fighting it. And when supremacy tried to segregate what he'd made universal, he walked away rather than compromise, choosing integrity over comfort, principle over position, truth over survival. Somewhere tonight, a trauma surgeon is transfusing plasma into a car accident victim, using blood preserved exactly as Drew taught, separated as he specified, stored in systems he designed. The surgeon doesn't think about Drew, doesn't know the history, doesn't realize they're practicing medicine that was revolutionary because a black man in 1940 refused to accept that race mattered more than chemistry? That's the final victory. Drew's work became so fundamental, so obviously correct, so completely integrated into medical practice that it's invisible now, like oxygen or gravity, essential and unremarkable. He wanted to save lives, not earn fame. He got both, though recognition came too late and too grudgingly, filtered through the resistance of men who couldn't believe genius wore his face. But the blood remembers. In every bag hanging beside a hospital bed, in every refrigerated unit at a donation center, in every emergency response protocol worldwide, Drew's decision to break every rule that prioritized hierarchy over healing still flows like oxygen through medicine's veins. He saved hundreds of thousands during the war. He saved millions since, though they'll never know his name. And perhaps that's the truest measure of revolution. Not the monuments or stamps or universities, but the quiet, persistent, life-giving systems that become so embedded in civilization that we forget they were once impossible, forbidden, dismissed as dreams by men who couldn't imagine that a black scientist from Washington would teach the world how to share blood without seeing color. Excellence did transcend the artificial barriers. Drew proved it with centrifuges and refrigerators and plasma that crossed an ocean to save a civilization. The tragedy is that he had to prove it at all. The triumph is that once proven, not even death could erase it. The blood still flows, carrying his revolution forward, one life at a time, forever.